Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 21 Hats podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Feldman. This week, special guest Rich Jordan tells Shawn Busse and Jay Goltz what it was like buying a small plumbing business in 2020, despite having very little experience with either plumbing or business, but having spent 10 years in the Marine Corps. When I reflected on my time in service and what I did well and what I enjoyed, Rich tells us, it was when I was on a small team with high stakes, far forward, far from the flagpole, responsible for making decisions and sustaining ourselves and figuring things out. So when I thought about that, small team, high stakes, self-sustained, small business kind of fit that bill. Not surprisingly, it took Rich some time to figure out what he was doing with the plumbing business. But in just 4 years, through organic growth and a few acquisitions, while taking no outside capital, he's gone from 3 plumbers and $1 million in annual revenue to about 90 employees and $20 million in revenue, which is why, Rich tells Jay and Shawn, he keeps moving the goalposts, reassessing just how big he wants the business to be. Even in good times, owning and running a business can be a lonely pursuit. Our hope is that these weekly conversations will let owners know they are not alone in facing challenges. In fact, that's the whole idea behind the 21 Hats community, engaging with other owners to get the kinds of insights only another owner can offer. If you're interested in learning more, step 1 is to sign up for a free trial of the Morning Report, which highlights the most important news of the day for business owners so you don't have to go looking for it. Step 2 is to get on our Slack channel, where you can ask questions, get vendor recommendations, and tap the wisdom of a very impressive crowd. Just search the 21 Hats Morning Report to subscribe. Joining me this week on the podcast are regulars Shawn Busse, CEO of Kinesis, which is based in Portland, Oregon, and works with small businesses on marketing, culture, and strategy. Jay Goltz, CEO of the Goltz Group, whose companies in Chicago include a picture frame business, artist frame service, and a home furnishing store, Jason Home. And special guest Rich Jordan, who is CEO of Strong Point Services, which has plumbing and HVAC businesses in New Jersey and New Hampshire. The episode is titled, A Few Good Plumbers. Welcome, Shawn, Jay, and especially Rich, our special guest today. It's great to have you here. Rich, maybe you could start by telling us a little about what you did before you bought a plumbing business about 4 years ago. Did you have any plumbing experience or business experience?
I did not have any business experience, really. Like 14 years ago, I had worked as a plumber's apprentice for a short amount of time before I entered the Marine Corps, and I spent all my 20s in the Marine Corps as an infantry officer prior to getting into business.
And was that good preparation, do you think?
I think so.
What did you take from it?
Particularly like getting into the trades like I did in the Marine Corps was definitely like a good testing ground and learning center for like blue collar leadership, right? One of the reasons I got into the trades is that I kind of hypothesized that that tradesmen would take well to the leadership style that I developed in the Marine Corps. Tradesmen are a lot like Marines, just a different trade, same kind of guy. So yeah, I mean, lots of lessons there, and then of course decentralized command and solving complex problems urgently, and operating with limited information and having a bias for action. Those are all things that I took out of the Marine Corps as well.
Rich, thanks for joining us. This is really interesting. Can you catch us all up to speed for those of us who aren't in the military or haven't been in the military in a long time? Kind of what's the kind of going philosophy, or at least what was the philosophy you developed there? Because I think a lot of people think of the military and they think command and control. And I don't know that that's necessarily accurate, but I would love to hear from you kind of what the modern military is like in terms of leadership philosophy.
Yeah, I love the question. In some areas of the military, sure. There is a kind of a more of a command and control philosophy. I'd say particularly in the Marine Corps and especially in like the combat arms areas of the Marine Corps, such as the infantry or artillery, combat engineers, things of that nature. It very, very much is more of a decentralized command model. And really, why is that? It's utilitarian in nature, really. Is a unit can move faster and adapt faster when decision making is pushed down to the point of influence or the point of friction, right? So the guy closest to the problem, right? The unit closest to the problem that needs to be solved, they need to be able to make decisions and not have to, like look over their shoulder and ask permission or ask for guidance from somebody who may be miles away, who may be, a planet away and, very far from what they're dealing with there. So the Marine Corps, I'd say more so than any other service. Of course, I've got some bias, but really we really do indoctrinate our leaders in this, is like very much invested in this concept of decentralized decision making and decentralized command. And truly that enables us to empower leaders at all levels. The Lance Corporal or Corporal who's in charge of 3 Marines, is able to make the right decision as close to the point of friction as possible. And that's generally the idea. There's this idea, if you all are familiar with the Boyd's OODA loop.
I am not.
The OODA loop is OODA, and it's observe, orient, decide, act. And Boyd, who was a kind of like a legendary thought leader in the Air Force around decision making and specifically competitive decision making, came up with this loop. So observe, orient, decide, act, and that basically is the loop of decision making. And the tighter you can get that loop, the faster you can go through that loop, the more likely you are to win in competition. And when you've got to go back to like a centralized authority to have a decision made and to take the next action, of course, that loop's going to be wider and longer and slower. So we can kind of tighten that loop, get actions happening at a faster pace if we decentralize command. So that was something that the Marine Corps really leans into that. I in particular really latched onto that. And I spent my final 2 years in the Marine Corps as an instructor at essentially like the officer leadership academy. It's called the Basic School in Quantico. And that was something that I was responsible for teaching.
Had you been deployed overseas, Rich?
Yes, I had. I deployed to Eastern Europe in 2016 when Russia first invaded Crimea. And then I deployed to the Middle East, to Afghanistan and Bahrain in 2017, 2018. I was there for a year.
Got it. So how did you develop a plan to buy a blue collar business? Where did that come from?
I think like a lot of guys leaving the service, I was really unsure of what I was going to do afterwards. But when I reflected on my time in service and what I did well and what I enjoyed, it was when I was on a small team with high stakes, far forward, far from the flagpole, responsible for making decisions and sustaining ourselves and figuring things out. When I thought about that, small team, high stakes, self-sustained, small business kind of fit that bill from what I could tell. And I had very limited visibility into what small business really was. But, it's kind of funny. I read a book that was very formative in my decision making. I read it. I left the service in the summer of 2020, and I read this book in the fall of 2019. And it was Small Giants by Bo Burlingham. My understanding is that Jay, who's on this call, was one of the guys featured in that book.
And I gave him the name.
He came up with the title Small Giants. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I that book was really really made an impression on me, and kind of seeing the journey that Jay and the folks featured in that book went through, and the things that matter to them, and the values they're able to drive through their businesses and things like that was something that really called to me. And so that was the fall of 2019 that I read that. And I spent the next, 9 months sort of self-educating on how could I get involved in that? Right or wrong, I felt at the time I didn't think I could make a compelling case to an existing business owner to bring me on as say a operations manager or something. Now, sitting where I sit now, I think that was probably misguided. I probably could have made a compelling case for that. So basically, I came to this conclusion that if I wanted to get involved in small business, I had to do it on my own. And then, starting a business seemed it's obviously can be difficult to do. So I got kind of onto this idea of buying a business, and then, like read everything I could on like how that process works, and like, the search, and read HBR's Guide to Buying a Small Business, read Brent Beshore's The Messy Marketplace, and just kind of self-educated, and then went after it. I ultimately got a small, very small plumbing contractor under contract just a few weeks before I left active duty, and was standing in front of those plumbers like 6 weeks after my final day in the Marine Corps.
Wow. How did you finance it, Rich?
I financed that with some cash savings that I had from deployments and an SBA loan.
Oh, cool.
That's interesting. So the SBA loan, I didn't even know an SBA loans money to someone who's never been in business to go buy a business. That's news to me. I didn't realize they did that.
Yeah. Whether it's a good idea or not, I won't.
It worked for you.
I won't make judgment. Yeah, it worked out all right for me. I would say, like they are risky propositions. The spectrum of SBA loans is a small loan. It was a small company.
I think you said it was less than $1 million in annual revenue with 3 plumbers. Is that right?
That's right. It was right about $1 million in revenue. 3 plumbers, no office infrastructure, no one. It was the owner and his wife kind of running the operation. So when they departed, there was not really much infrastructure there. I didn't recognize this prior to showing up on day one, but very quickly became clear there was a lot of risk in that deal.
Did they have any special program because you're a veteran? Did that have anything to do with it?
I think they would have given me the money regardless if I was a veteran or not, but they did. They do have some programs. Like there's a fairly significant SBA like origination fee involved in those loans. I think on that deal, it might have been something like $25,000. That was waived for me because I was a veteran.
What was that first day like?
Yeah, the first 2 days I think were interesting. We took over on a Thursday morning. I've since kind of learned, if you're going to take over business, you should probably take it over early in the week as opposed to later in the week. Give yourself some time to get your hands around it before your staff goes into the weekend.
And doesn't come back.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So we took it over on a Thursday morning. It was the Thursday right before Labor Day weekend in 2020. And, it was just meeting the plumbers in the parking lot. It's like really informal, just kind of like stand up around a tailgate. And then, guys had jobs to get to. So they immediately kind of like launched into their jobs. Didn't get like a terribly warm response from the team.
Rich, how old were you and how old were they?
I was 29. I was going to turn 30 soon. I was 29. And I have a partner as well. He was there as well. He's also 29 at the time.
Can you give us a little background of, so the owner and the wife own this plumbing business. Had they been trying to sell it for a while? I mean, did the employees know it was for sale? Were the employees relieved when they finally, they found out that, because I got to believe most plumbing businesses, like most frame shops, just go away one day and don't sell. That's my guess. Is that correct?
Yep. Especially at that size. Yeah.
Right.
The reality is at that size, there's just not really any like enterprise value to transfer. No, I didn't realize that at the time. So I had the privilege of paying for that. But yeah, you're right. A lot of them don't trade and they just close their doors.
Because basically they're trying to sell a job. I mean, I talk to frame shops. They say, I made $40,000 last year. And I go, well, then why would someone pay you? They could go make that in a job and not put any money into it. So they're trying to sell a job. In this case, the plumber was probably making more money is my guess. So because $1 million is not terrible. It's better than a lot of frame shops are doing $200,000 a year. So there's something there, $1 million.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, especially when you've invested like no money in overhead and your only kind of like fixed cost is, like liability insurance.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, he was pulling in, nearly $400,000 a year. I mean, really like lived a great life, put his kids through school, had several vacation homes and rental properties, nice cars, stuff like that. So he'd done well for himself, but hadn't really built much business value.
So how old were the plumbers, the employees, and what happened on that Thursday and Friday?
Sure. So yeah, one guy they had just hired like in the weeks leading up to it to sort of like replace the capacity of the departing owner. He was 27, pretty junior. There's another guy that was 23, pretty talented plumber, and had worked for him since he was 17. And then there was another guy who was 40 and had worked in this business for 17 years at the time. And there was, unbeknownst to me, there was a sort of unwritten understanding that senior plumber was going to take the business over at some point. So there was a little bit of a cultural issue there initially.
Well, I presume that he didn't have the cash or the wherewithal or the idea to go to the SBA for a loan. Is that, or he didn't want to take the risk of it? Do you know which one it was? Did he not know about the SBA, or did he not want to take the risk?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that neither he nor really the seller kind of understood the tools that were available, the financial tools that were available to them to get a deal done.
Do you think he was properly marketing this plumbing business? Because from my experience of looking at people, they're trying to sell their business, but they don't want to tell anybody, keep it under wraps. And then they try selling it for 6 months or a year and then throw in the towel. I have to believe, as a plug-in doing $1 million a year, that another plumbing company it would have been a great thing to just buy it and, hook it right onto their existing business. Did he talk to other plumbing businesses before he sold it to you? Do you know?
No, I think he was pretty cagey about stuff like that. And a lot of guys in his position are, to your point.
Yeah.
Well, it's tough. It's tough too, because, there's kind of like a gossip circle in the trades, right? So if you start talking to another plumbing shop about being bought, you're worried that the word gets out, right? I mean, I'm guessing, yeah. Rich. I don't know.
And it often does get out, frankly.
Yeah.
I know, but they shoot themselves in the foot. So the word doesn't get out, but then they don't sell the business. So how did that work?
But the problem though, is you're talking a licensed trade. This is Rich, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, sure. Right? Like in terms of what it means to be a journeyman and an apprentice and kind of the constraints.
I didn't consider that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that 40-year-old plumber who had ideas that business might be his, he had never actually achieved his master's license.
Oh, wow.
So that's a problem. And in New Jersey, this isn't true in every state. We have another business now in New Hampshire. That's where I'm coming to you from right now. It's different in New Hampshire, but in New Jersey, at least 10% of the company has to be owned by a licensed master plumber in the state. And that's like hard and fast. So we actually have a third partner in New Jersey that's our master plumber. We brought him in to through the process. We met him, vetted him, brought him in. So we have a master plumber on the team. He holds the license. He has 10% equity, and he's also like our install foreman at this point. So he's a full-time staff.
Did you know going into this, you would have to bring in somebody else in order to actually own the business?
There was some discovery that happened in the due diligence process. Put it like that. Okay. And we initially, we actually, if I remember correctly, we were aware of the requirement, and we thought we had a guy that would hold it for us. And then basically he kind of like pulled the rug out from under us like halfway through diligence, and wasn't interested in progressing. So we then had to go find a master plumber, and like the interviews I had in those days were just brutal, just absolute wild characters that we talked to.
How did that differ from your experience in the military in terms of interviewing? Because is this your first time interviewing people like to hire for a job?
Yeah. It was. So,
what'd you learn?
I think this is something that a lot of new managers fall into too, is like, you just don't know the right questions to ask and how to dig in, so you're mostly doing this kind of like vibe check. Right. And that's largely what that was at the time. So we made a bunch of, in the early days of that business, we made a bunch of bad hires. Had to really figure it out over time.
So the guy that was the master plumber, correct me if I'm wrong, he must be making a really good living being a plumber. I would have thought he would have said, okay, I'll do it with you. Give me a third. You both keep a third. He certainly didn't get that much equity, but I presume he's got a good job out of it. Would that be accurate, you think?
Sure. Yep. He's got a good, well-paying job out of it. He's got, ownership in a business now that he didn't have before. He's got upside. And for him, that was enough.
So it was a bonus, basically.
Yeah. And he was making a decent hourly wage at his last job, but he was a union plumber. And, like the issue that he had is like he would make, $75 an hour or something as a union plumber, but then he'd go unemployed for 6 months, right? Because that's kind of how the unions operate. So he'd be on a big project for 6 months, and he'd be unemployed for 6 months.
I want to make sure we get through some of the basics of Rich's journey. Could you just tell us the nature of the relationship with your partner? What were your respective roles?
So I had just left the Marine Corps and was essentially unemployed. So I jumped in as the like day-to-day general manager, like wearing a lot of hats at the time. He worked in like heavy maritime construction as like a project manager, supervisor. He's an engineer by trade. So he stayed at his job doing that for essentially the first year. And he's local to that business. And you kind of help me after hours and things like that on the weekend and stuff, augment me. But he stayed there because the business wasn't large enough to support us both. And then by the time a year had gone by, we essentially doubled the business. And we felt that we could like confidently support us both at that time. So he left his job and then joined us full time.
And he's still involved in the business?
That's right. Yep. So now current state of affairs, we have 2 brands in 2 markets, New Jersey and New Hampshire. He runs New Jersey. And then I kind of sit as the executive over both companies. And then I also run the day-to-day operations in New Hampshire.
Okay. So sticking with the first business you bought for a minute, it sounded like you had something to share about what happened with the employees that first weekend. Could you tell us that? And then tell us, how did you double the business over the first year? Yeah, I mean that first day, what happened is the first day was fine, just kind of like a whirlwind. The seller took me around to all the different vendors and distributors that he used, introduced us. We filled out credit applications and things like that. So sort of like kind of administration. His wife was still kind of handling a lot of the phones and stuff at that point. So we had a little bit of standoff. We realized that we had not had the foresight to get gas cards for all the plumbers ahead of time. So my partner and I spent, decent part of the evening that night round robining the trucks to the gas station to fill them up for the next day. And then when I was on my way in to the office the next morning, I got a call from the seller that that senior plumber was one, upset, and 2 had already received several like white knight job offers from our competitors. And so I was like, oh man, we're going into Labor Day weekend. Like this guy's got job offers in hand. He's upset about the transaction. He doesn't know me from Adam. And he was trying to get on the road early with his family for a vacation for the weekend. And jobs were pouring in, and there was a chance that he was going to be late to that as well. So what I did is I jumped in the truck and I went and met him out at a job around noon and helped him put a water heater in. Basically spent 2 hours with him as a helper, putting this water heater into this woman's basement. And the whole time just talking to him about his experience, ideas that he had for improvement for the business, like kind of just like getting his insight on friction points that he dealt with on a daily basis and what we could maybe do to roll out improvements, and basically just like really allowed him to feel heard, and like kind of gave him some confidence that, like a lot of things that he was bringing up, I was like, yeah, I actually had an idea for that, and maybe I was planning on not rolling that out for a while, but maybe we could roll it out faster. So he went into the weekend, I think, with a lot more confidence. I certainly went into the weekend with a lot more confidence.
Wait, did you tell him that you talked to the owner and you heard that he was bitching about, getting cut out? And he's thinking, did you have an honest conversation about that?
Nope. No. No, I kept that to myself. So for me, it's just he and I, me just getting out there and helping him and having a candid conversation.
Well, not that candid. Yeah.
I bet there's some friction between him and the owner. Is that fair?
Yeah, especially with the sale. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like he probably felt betrayed, right?
Yeah.
And so if you had gone to him and said, "Hey, I talked to Bob, the former owner," now you're aligning with Bob, when in reality you need to build a relationship with him. So that's a great move, man. That's really impressive.
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, ultimately, I think that act, I look back, that was 4 years ago. I look back and I think that really was meaningful. I mean, there was really not a whole lot of meat on that business. Had we lost him, we would have been in a really tough spot. And I think that ultimately kept him around. And he's still with us.
Wow.
He's still with us to this day.
Wow. That's awesome.
You were talking about the fact that you hadn't had experience hiring. The big difference between, I suspect, being a leader in the military and being a leader of a business is in the military, you work with the people you're given and you can't easily fire them. Do you think you approached this more with the attitude of working with the people you had than maybe someone else might have?
Yeah. And I think in ways that was beneficial, right? Like in this moment, I think that was beneficial. In other ways, I think it wasn't. Further down the path that year, to your point, like my experience led me to put up and tolerate like behaviors that like today I wouldn't tolerate, right? Like today, like that person would be terminated. We'd find somebody else. And at the time, I think I was so used to working with what I had, making it work, trying to hold guys accountable and get them to where I need them to be. And some guys, some people just aren't built the way you need. So I think ultimately, the punchline there is like, I think we held on to some people longer than we should have. And part of that was fueled by my experience.
Well, to be fair, you and just about every other entrepreneur on earth in the beginning keeps people longer than they should. I don't know that I've ever met anybody who says, oh, no, I was right on that one from the beginning. So I don't think this had anything to do with the military. It's just getting rid of your naivete that you can't fix everybody. And some people just don't belong at the business and they belong somewhere else. So that's kind of a 101 learning curve lesson of owning a business.
Sure. Yeah.
So how did you double sales?
Oh, man. Wrenched on a lot of levers early. A lot of it was productivity increases. So like, I think a lot of guys who are coming into this business without experience, they assume that they're just going to like fire the marketing engine, just like turn on the boosters of marketing. It's going to do that. For us, like that wasn't necessarily the case. It really was all like productivity, efficiency, some pricing. So for us, like we went from like pen and paper to an ERP. That was like a little bit easier to use, easier to communicate, easier to dispatch. For one, like we invested in our customer service team. So that we were actually answering the phones and picking up the phones.
So you think there was some pent up demand out there that you couldn't get to because you couldn't get the jobs done fast enough. So people were calling and somebody was saying, yeah, we can't see you till next week. And they just went somewhere else, right? Isn't that what you're basically saying? You raised your capacity?
If you even answered the phone at all. Yeah. I think there was a lot of pent up. There was a lot of demand available. So basically, that first year was really just capturing the demand.
Yeah.
In a small business that's doing $1 million in sales, it's not, you only need another $1 million to double, right? And I always kind of talk about it, it's like this kind of sinusoidal wave, right? Of like you're capturing demand and then you're trying to increase demand to fill capacity and then now you're capturing demand again. And so we kind of went through all those cycles. But in that first year, it was largely just capturing demand and trying to do it in an efficient manner.
Did you have to double employees to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we finished that year with 12 employees. So you could say, quadrupled employees to double sales. So we definitely saw, people talk about the J curve, right? Like EBITDA and earnings kind of taking a dip on those early journeys. And we certainly saw that too. We did not clear as much money in that first year as the seller was clearing on his own.
Despite doubling sales?
Despite doubling sales.
Well, let's be fair though. The guy was working. I mean, he was earning the money partially because he was probably a very skilled plumber and he was out there, you're paying himself. So it's a separation of paying yourself versus the profit of the company. So,
well, and he wasn't investing in infrastructure at all, right? It sounds like he was just creating all kinds of, infrastructure debt. And you were basically building a system that could scale. His system could have never scaled it if you had just kept running it as it was.
Right.
No, but I'll tell you something. You have explained why so many plumbing businesses are like that. Because at the end of the day, the guy was making a lot of money, $300,000-$400,000 a year. It wasn't broke as far as he was concerned. He didn't have to turn into an incredible business person and scale and everything. The guy was making plenty of money, and he had his boat, and he had his summer home, and he had, so describes a lot of people in the trades. They make a lot of money, and they don't ever have to really fix the business part because they don't have the aspiration of running a $5 or $10 million company. And I think that's typical.
Yeah, it's like these guys aren't stupid. You know what I mean? They're making a great living for themselves. And the reality is, like, in order to scale, like, there's really no way for them to scale without truly like dipping into their own pockets. Right.
Yeah, they'd have to sacrifice.
So yeah, I think it's very difficult to like kind of take that next step. And we also see guys that have built, $3 million businesses that we've acquired. And they make less money than the guy running the $1 million business. Right. Because there's more volume, they require more infrastructure. And they haven't like kind of like gotten over the hump where they can really start making money. So like it's kind of like that like dead zone between like say $1.5 million of revenue and at least in my business like $1.5 million in revenue and say $5 million in revenue, and that can be like really like a wasteland of people just kind of like stuck, not making as much money as they were making on their own.
Rich, I think you said that in that first year you made some pricing changes that were impactful. What happened there?
Yeah, I'd say we screwed it up at first. With plumbing and heating businesses, you kind of have companies split on either side of a line. And so companies basically either charge time and materials, right? So they give you an hourly rate and then they have a markup on materials and that's what they give you. And it's very transparent. And those are usually like shops like the one I bought, like very, very small. And then that can be frustrating for the homeowner because a lot of times like the bill at the end of the day is a surprise, right? Depending on how long the job took or whatever, I'm not getting agreement on the price until I finish the job and tell you how much it is. And sometimes that can be rough on the homeowner. The other companies are flat rate, like upfront pricing companies. Typically you'll see like any kind of like scaled company is going to be a flat rate upfront price company. And that's basically like every sort of task that can be performed has a set price, like menu style pricing for it.
Like going to a car dealer, they've got that Chilton book. They say, here's the price per hour, but they don't necessarily put that amount of hours into it.
Right, exactly. So there's an ability for the contractor to make more margin if he's more efficient, right? So now I'm incentivized to have highly skilled technicians as opposed to poorly skilled technicians with upfront pricing. I'm also like getting agreement, right? Like, hey, at the end of this job, you're going to have a fully functioning water heater and you're going to have hot water in your home. It's going to cost this amount of money. Does that work for you? Customer says yes. And then that's the bill they end up paying at the end of the day, right? So there's agreement up front and then no surprises. So that's how we operate. When we made that change, because that initial company that started as a time and material company at a fairly like premium rate, and we took that hourly rate that he was using and we just like slapped that onto our upfront pricing, like kind of math. And the reality is that time and materials companies are generally going to charge you for all the time that they're at your home. Some will even charge you from the moment they leave their shop to when they get back to their shop, but they're definitely going to charge you for all the time that they're in your home. The upfront pricing, like kind of price books, are generally built for, because this is really the only way to build them, is they're built for the amount of wrench time that the task takes, right? So you're not getting that hourly rate for the entire time you're in the home. You're only getting that hourly rate for, the 15 minutes that it takes to install a frost-free hose bib on the outside of the home, right? You might be at the house for an hour, but the task is generically built for 15 minutes. So we took the hourly rate he was using and we just translated it directly over to the flat rate upfront price book. And we saw our margins just crater. And we weren't really smart enough to figure it out at first. And the reality is that like our billing efficiency tanked, is what happened. So really like, now being in the industry a little bit longer, like a plumbing service company, that's on an upfront pricing model is generally only going to bill for 40% of its time, right? So if a guy works a 10-hour day, he's only going to bill for 4 hours because he did 4 hours of wrench time and he had all this drive time and he had all this diagnostic time and presentation time and explanation time and all that stuff. So basically, 40% billing efficiency, it means whatever hourly rate you needed to charge, well, you're kind of like back of the house hourly rate, and that upfront pricing math needs to be 2.5 times whatever your desired hourly rate is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I knew this was coming. I was waiting for the punchline because,
Yeah.
I mean, I live through, we hang pictures, and no matter what I charge per hour, it doesn't cover because there's no way I'm billing for anything close to 8 hours a day, to your point. Loading the van, unloading the van, coming in the morning. It's the nature of the beast. That's why stuff costs more, because it takes longer than you think when you build everything else in. You certainly can't just charge for quote unquote wrench time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we went through like a very difficult 2 months financially when we made that choice and didn't understand the math behind it. Ultimately we adjusted rates to accommodate that change in billing efficiency, and then it worked. But that's something that, because I talk to guys all the time now that are getting into the trade for the first time and taking over a time and materials company, and they want to switch to flat rate. I think I've saved quite a few folks from the same headache that I had.
Is there like a universal book all these plumbers are subscribing to that it's like, well, a water heater takes this long and a hose bib takes this long? Or is that your own internal, experience, and you use that to determine how long something will take?
It's a mix of both. There are third-party services that will provide you that kind of like generic time and materials for the book, and then you plug in your hourly rate, you plug in your material markup, and then boom, you've got a price book. We use something like that now, and a lot of companies do. And then it's like that gets you like 75% of the way there, and then it's a lot of tweaking and adjusting. At the end of the day, we're trying to make anywhere between 12 and 20%. Customers and other kind of smaller contractors like to do their napkin math on what they think you're bringing in, and what I find is that they're almost always only taking into account like the cost of goods sold, right? So they think you're upcharging by you're ripping people off by 2x what the price should be, and it's like, well, hey man, I'm targeting a 50% gross margin, so yes, you are correct. It is twice what the cost of goods was.
And the guy that was your key plumber that you saved from leaving, here we are years later. He happy? Nice relationship? He's at peace, Oh,
yeah. He is certainly a success story for us. His family's in a good spot. He's making a lot more money now than he was previously. And he was actually like grossly underpaid when we took over.
I'm guessing you're paying your people way better than they were paid in the past.
Yeah, and we take really good care of him. So like he might have been making like 60 grand a year before, like now he makes like 120.
Well, partially because the owner was a master plumber and keep an eye on his guys. And you need to rely on the guys. You're paying more because you need professional guys. You're going to need less management because you're not a plumber. So that makes sense.
Yep, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Rich, how did you make the leap to buying other blue collar businesses?
The very first add-on deal we ever did really was like a guy who happened to get my cell phone number from a vendor, a shared vendor. And he called me. He was like, hey, I have this little small kind of commercial backflow testing plumbing company. It's just me and a truck. And I want to move to Vermont. Can you take over my accounts? And we paid him like, a few $1,000 to take over his accounts. And that was like 4 months after we took over the first business. And that was a success. It was small, kind of inconsequential, but it was a success. And then, 18 months after that first acquisition, we had joined this industry best practice group. My partner and I were at this sort of like annual business planning workshop as a part of that. And we sat at a table for 3 days with this older gentleman who owned an HVAC company in New Hampshire, him and his general manager. And we were all, the point of the whole thing was we were planning, taking all of our inputs from the previous year and making assumptions for the next year and on a seasonal basis and mapping out like our budgeted performance for the next year. We were kind of picking his brain because we wanted to add HVAC as a trade in New Jersey. And ultimately, we kind of set up with him that we were going to come visit him in New Hampshire to see how an HVAC company runs as opposed to a plumbing company. And we had grown sales in New Jersey to like $2.5 million at that point. And my partner was full time running that in New Jersey, so I had a little more bandwidth. And so basically, the the guy that we went and visited in New Hampshire ultimately kind of proposed to us. Him and his wife took us out to dinner while we were up there visiting. Like, hey, like, you guys crazy enough to buy a business in New Hampshire? And we were. So a lot of lessons learned there. Turns out running 2 businesses in 2 markets is about 5 times harder than running 1 business in 1 market. But that's been a major success story for us. We took over his business. It was like $3 million in revenue, like 15 employees. That business today is $15 million in revenue and 65 employees. 2 years later, 2.5 years later.
Aside from you being more experienced at that point, why do you think that business scaled so fast? You know, what was the difference there?
I think HVAC in general is a little bit easier to scale than plumbing. A big part of our growth here with the HVAC company has been really leaning into building our base of recurring annual maintenances, like annual maintenance contracts, which is just more customers go for that when they're protecting their like expensive HVAC equipment more so than they want to like protect their water heater or their plumbing systems. It seems like it's an easier product to sell on the HVAC side. So we've built, the previous owner had about 1,000 maintenance plans. We have almost 5,000 now.
Okay, but correct me if I'm wrong. Part of the reason that business scaled easier than the first plumbing guy, he had an infrastructure. He had a real business.
Sure.
So you just had to improve it. The other guy, you were basically building an infrastructure from scratch because the guy was a plumber with a couple of other plumbers. So
yeah, that's a great point. And that's absolutely true. He had spent the time and the treasure to build a little bit of infrastructure. He had taken a little bit of hit on his bottom line in order to do that. And we were able to step in and kind of tweak it as opposed to having to build it essentially from scratch.
Well, you know what? I just thought about this. HVAC is a growing industry. Plumbing is not radically changing, but the HVAC industry with, mini splits and technology is changing radically. And so that creates more market opportunity, I would guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And your efforts in the HVAC space are somewhat leveraged in that, like, there's always that ability to get that big ticket with HVAC.
Right.
It's a little bit harder to achieve in plumbing. In plumbing, it's like sewers, like sewer replacements and stuff. A little bit harder to manufacture those opportunities. In HVAC, like your outbound sales efforts, the amount of like customer connections that you're making, just like you can increase activity, and ultimately that kind of filters down probabilistically to more large tickets at the end of the day. And we've been able to kind of play that game.
And then in your state, is the licensure thing also a little more advantageous, in terms of HVAC versus plumbing? Like it's a little easier in terms of the requirements, or is it also a high requirement industry?
As an owner in New Hampshire, it is easier from a licensure perspective because you just need an employee to hold the license. From a talent recruitment standpoint, in some ways it's harder. Because all of your technicians need to be licensed. In New Jersey, actually, none of your technicians need to be licensed, but the owner needs to hold the license.
Rich, when you bought the plumbing business, did you have in mind that you were going to create kind of a holding company and buy a bunch of other businesses? Were you thinking that way right from the start?
No, it wasn't. I kind of laugh, like, the goalposts keep moving. I'm sure like you guys I imagine you might be able to relate to this as well. We keep like unlocking opportunity and things, and then the goalposts move again. If you had asked me in 2020 what my goals were, I would have said like, man, it'd be really awesome to run a $2 million plumbing business.
Well, since you've suffered through the learning curve, Bick, for some basic stuff, let me help you at your age and how long you've been in business to say to you, maybe you should think about if you were doing X millions of dollars, you'd be making a fortune, could buy anything you want and have a lovely life instead of doing what I used to do. Grow until I finally realize, you know what? It's big enough. So I would challenge you to think about, is there a size that's just big enough? Or do you have some innate need to grow it to a, $50 million company or something, which it's going to cost you? I don't mean money wise. It's going to cost you in your life.
That was the small giants guy talking there, Rich.
Yeah. Excellent point. That's exactly the point.
Yeah. Feedback well taken. I'd say, for me, it's not so much about growing. Of course, it manifests this way, but it's not psychologically. I think it's not so much about growing revenue. It's about like realizing my potential and realizing the potential of the team. That I think is what's driving the growth, is like this like desire to like continue to create opportunities for talented people.
Well, first, where are your goalposts now? What are your goals?
I say right now they're sitting at, 50 million in revenue and 200 employees, probably the kind of soft goal.
How old are you now?
33.
God, you're so young. All right. I was there in my 40s, and then I finally figured out, like, there's a price to pay for getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. My goalpost is I want to be happy. I want my employees happy. I want my family happy. That's the goalpost. Versus I want to do $100 million by, that's a whole nother animal.
I think the initial growth stages were largely to try to be able to afford infrastructure that allowed the business to really feel like a business.
Sure. No, totally.
So yeah, I think that's largely what's kind of brought us here, is like trying to build for like survivability and sustainability. And I think it's only recently sort of pivoted to kind of like opportunistic. But yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, I appreciate the pushback.
Rich, are you planning on growing primarily by acquisition or organically?
For us, organically, really. We find that, like acquisitions are extremely disruptive, and you're essentially like, we did a pretty sizable acquisition in February for us. We did a acquisition of a direct competitor in New Hampshire. It was 30 employees, largest one we've ever done. And it was a great success. It worked out great. But I think, fairly easily it could have gone the other way. And you're hiring 30 employees like sight unseen is really what it is.
Back to the military.
Right, exactly. So for us, I think like we're still open to acquisition opportunities. I'd say like we're not in pursuit like we might have been before. And I think that's a symptom of before, we were kind of like, in those wasteland that I talked about earlier, right? That like $1 to $5 million wasteland. You can kind of feel like you're up against this ceiling and it's difficult to fight out of it. You don't have the resources to like help you get over the hump and invest in the infrastructure, and it can be hard. So I think like in that stage, it felt like the only way to meaningfully grow was to do an acquisition. Now, like we've kind of have this like meat and like resources and staff, and we feel like we can fairly reliably like organically grow and like kind of pull these levers and tweak and see the year over year growth without an acquisition. My appetite for acquisitions has certainly diminished. Now, if someone walked in here today and was like, "Hey, I've got this great business and I want to sell it to you for a great deal," like, yeah, of course.
Which is going to happen. I mean, that is going to happen.
Have you taken investment dollars?
Nope. This is all just me and my partner, just personal cash and operating funds.
Would you consider that to do an acquisition if the right acquisition came along?
If the right acquisition came along and we felt like we had like an aligned investment partner, I think we would be open to it. But I think the stars, would have to be aligned, and we'd want to make sure we weren't giving up our autonomy and direction.
Read Small Giants again a couple times. I mean, I have to tell you, anyone that goes, "Oh, he's a silent partner." Yeah, I don't know that there's such a thing as a silent partner. And I don't care whose money you got. The fact of the matter is you're not in control of your own destiny at that point. And I would absolutely argue, don't do it. Just don't do it, period.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically how I see it right now. Now, I'm trying to keep an open mind, right? As opposed to being like just blanket no. But I see it largely the same as you do, Jay.
Can I summarize? What you've talked about is hiring and firing is critical in growing and running a business, which you went through the whole process, you and everyone else. 2, pricing. People don't look at pricing enough. Pricing's critical to fixing a business, making more money. 3, there is tremendous opportunity. There are a lot of small business owners out there that don't know how to sell the business, that don't want to tell anybody, and then they just die in the vine. And if you go and look for those people, there could be a good deal could be cut. And the last one, last but not least, God bless the SBA loans. I mean, I've used them to buy 3 buildings. I couldn't have done it without the SBA loans. So a totally underused resource out there, no question about it.
Well, let me add one more thing to that, which is I think the big difference between what Rich has done and what you did, Jay, and to some extent what you did, Shawn, and more traditional business owners have done, is that Rich went into a business. He had some small experience in the underlying tasks that business required, but wasn't really doing that job before he became a business owner. And I guess I'm curious, Rich, do you think it was ever a problem for you that you didn't have a deeper feel for plumbing itself?
I think it presented its challenges, but it's not impossible to solve,
Clearly.
At the end of the day, what I sort of landed on was that I needed to know enough about plumbing to understand like how long jobs are going to take and what material was required and what support my plumbers needed so that I could price those jobs effectively, so I could resource the technicians effectively. And ultimately, like that's the level of knowledge that I needed. And I also just needed to be willing to leverage the latent talent on the team to help bridge that gap as well until I had it.
Do you handle the plumbing in your own home now, Rich?
I do. To an extent, I do. Yeah. I'll do, clean my own drains and service my own boiler and stuff like that.
If we're talking takeaways from this, I think a really interesting thing here is your experience in leadership and operations. Just like understanding this idea of distributed decision-making is so powerful, and how these large organizations really struggle to be effective, I think, because they get that OOPA loop. I'm sorry, I can't remember. OODA loop. They get the OODA loop wrong, and I think you've done such a good job of bringing that experience in your life into the business space. And it really illustrates how there are businesses where it's less about the technical expertise and a lot more about OODA loops and good leadership. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that, man. That was awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Well, this was great. My thanks to Shawn Busse, Jay Goltz, and Rich Jordan. One thing before you go. Everything we do at 21 Hats is created by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs to help us all learn together. If you get something out of listening to these podcast episodes, consider joining the conversation. You can do that by joining the 21 Hats Sounding Board, a Slack channel where you can tap the wisdom of a very smart crowd, or by becoming a founding member and joining our monthly Zoom forum, where you can be part of conversations much like the ones we have on the podcast. You can sign up for both by subscribing to the Morning Report. If you have any questions, you can email me at lauren@21hats.com. And if you get something out of this podcast or out of the Morning Report, please tell a friend, tell an enemy, tell every business owner you know. Your word of mouth, owner to owner, will always be the most effective way to build this community for all of us. Thank you. It means a lot. This episode was produced by another entrepreneur, Jess Stuberon, founder of Blank Word Productions. Thanks for listening, everyone.